of the book of Esther. So I was looking what to speak about on this book. There is just so much in it. It's one of those books that the more you look into it, the more you find that is in there. It's a strange book in one way because we know that the name of God is never mentioned. In all of, I'd say 9 chapters, it's actually 10 chapters, but chapter 10 is only 3 verses. In all of its chapters, the name of God is never mentioned. In all of its chapters, we never have one mention of prayer. Yes, there's fasting, but there's no mention of prayer and there's no mention of God. And yet you can't get into the book of Esther without seeing the hand of God everywhere. You know, there's a little saying, isn't it, that the devil is in the detail, often used as solicitors and, you know, things that are written. But in the book of Esther, we see that God is in the detail. And I've got a little quote here, because Esther is very much a book about providence, about how God's working intimately in all our lives, in every situation, at every moment. You know, some people think of God as being, you know, a transcendent God, as it were, that's out there, who's created the world, wound it up like a clock, stood back and looking to see what happens. You're on your own. Sort of the deist kind of view. Others think that God is everywhere, like because God is immanent, and there's nowhere that God is not, that, well, we can worship this pulpit or this lectern because that must be God. No, God is in it, but this lectern is not God. That's pantheism. But we're theists. We believe that there is a God who is out there, but he is in here. He's everywhere present. And he's not just created this world, but he's also intimately involved in every single thing that happens and takes place, which will ultimately result in his glory. So when problems come your way, you can understand that actually God is there. He knows exactly what's happening. When coincidences take place in your life, you can understand that they're by no means coincidences. They're not just chance happenings. God is there and he's doing something. And even when things are good, when things are bad, God is in the midst working out his purposes. So Providence, I think I read a quote from, who was it? It was Warren Wiersbe in his book on Ruth and Esther, and he quotes Augustus Strong from his systematic theology, who says, as far as providence is concerned, it's God's attention concentrated everywhere. Now, if you can imagine the God of this universe, the God of this whole creation, vast as it is, and yet the attention of that God is concentrated everywhere. The very hairs of your head are numbered. The thoughts that go on inside, the seemingly difficult situations that you go through, God's infinite concentration is on you and your circumstances. And he knows what's happening. And when I look at the book of Esther, you know, we see, yes, it's a book of providence. It's a lovely story about this girl who's taken from just being an orphan in a strange land, and she rises up to become the queen of Persia. It's a good story about how her cousin comes to be second in command over the realm of Persia. There's so much in there that we can learn about and see, and it's a great story. But within that story, there's something more that is happening. And that something more that is happening is spiritual warfare. You may think, well, what are you on about spiritual warfare from the book of Esther? But just bear with me, because I just want to lay a foundation this morning. I don't even know if we'll start at the book of Esther, but just have to see how it goes. But in the book of Revelation, in chapter 12, you know, sometimes when we start a meeting, we have enter into his gates with thanksgiving, enter into his courts with praise. There's that kind of, you know, let's just all get ourselves ready to praise God. And I was thinking this morning that, you know, it'd be nice to start with something a bit different. And I was going to start with Revelation 12:7. It says, "And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but did not prevail." You think, well, what a strange verse that is. But we can see that the inhabitants of the earth can rejoice because the devil is defeated. The devil is defeated. But he fought. And there was a fight between the angels of God in the heavenly realms, and there was a fight between the dragon, the devil, these angels of his, the followers of his. Something was going on in the spiritual realm. A spiritual warfare was taking place. You know the well-known little verse in Ephesians chapter 6 where it talks about the armour of God. And it says in verse 12, it says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Now, I prefer the old authorized version there, which says, "For we wrestle, not against flesh and blood, but against these principalities and powers in the heavenly places." For we wrestle. We're soldiers. As Christians, we're soldiers. We're thrown into a wrestling match. We're called to fight. We're called to put on the whole armour of God. It's not a party. It's not a party. It's a fight. It's a war that we enroll in when we come to know the Lord Jesus Christ. So here we've got, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against." For we do not wrestle. I don't like that. It's "for we wrestle." Not against flesh and blood, but against these principalities and powers. And God has given us armour, spiritual armour, that we need to put on. If you go into the book of Daniel, which was set not far around the time of Esther, reading in the book of Daniel, you can see there that there is tremendous spiritual warfare that goes on in the heavenly realm. Daniel chapter, where are we? Let me see. Yeah, Daniel chapter 10. It says, "In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The message was true, etc., etc. In those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant food. No meat or wine came into my mouth. Nor did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. And 3 weeks later, an angel visits Daniel. And it's quite incredible that this angel comes and says that, on the first day that you prayed, your prayers were heard. But for 3 weeks, I've been fighting against the prince of Persia. There was spiritual warfare going on. The first time he prayed, it was heard. But it took time for that answer to his prayer to come, because something was happening in the spiritual and in the heavenly realms. And at the end of chapter 10 in Daniel, it says, "Do you know why I've come to you? And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I've gone forth, indeed, the prince of Greece will come." And so you've got here Michael, the prince over Israel, was engaged in this kind of spiritual heavenly warfare that was going on. And we as Christians quite often miss the fact that things are happening that God is doing up there. The secret things belong unto God. Those things which are revealed belong unto us, to our children, that we might do all the works of his law. But there are things that are going on up there that we're not always aware of. And then actually God doesn't want us necessarily to be aware of. But Daniel just prayed, but his answer took 3 weeks, because there was something happening in the spiritual realms, not just to do with, people, but to do with empires, to do with nations. Following Persia, Greece would arise. Following Greece, the Roman Empire would arise. Tremendous things were going on. And these people of God, these Christians, were in the midst of it. If you remember when we were looking at, I can't remember what it was now, a while back, we were looking in Genesis at the life of Abraham. And in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, it talks about people blessing Israel and people cursing Israel, or God's people. And God gives promises to Abraham. And it says, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So there's a promise there that those people who are favourable towards God's people will receive blessing. Those who are antagonistic against them will receive cursing. Right? And so there's certain principles that are in the Bible that actually operate and control a lot of what is taking place. I don't know if you noticed in the book of Esther, I didn't read the 2nd chapter, you'll have to read that later when you go home, chapters 1 and 2 and 3. But it's very interesting in the book of Esther. In chapter 2, we've got this story where you've got King Ahasuerus, right? He's the ruler of the whole of the Persian Empire, which stretches from basically Pakistan across India, I don't know who's into geography here, south of Russia, Kazakhstan and all the other stands there, Georgia, going across to Turkey, as far as Greece, all down the eastern side of the Mediterranean, down to Egypt, Ethiopia, which is now sort of like modern northern Sudan, and all the way back again, 127 provinces it was divided into, an absolutely huge empire. And it says for 180 days he was entertaining and, showing off his royal splendour and glory to all these people. And then he holds a feast, another feast for 7 days. And he just wanted to show off everything, the greatness of his kingdom. And he gets to that point at the end of that feast where he gets a little bit drunk. And he says, what else have I got to show? How else can I show my glory? And he says, I know, my wife. My wife. He had the most beautiful wife. He wouldn't have had anybody who wasn't beautiful. But he had probably the most beautiful woman who was in the kingdom. And he sends his eunuchs to her and says, come on, she was having a feast with her ladies, I want you to come and to display your royal glory. Wear your crown and come. And just display your beauty. It's the last thing I can think of, just to boast and to show these people. Show your beauty before everybody. And we realise that Vashti refused to come. And one of the good things about the book of Esther is it leaves lots of questions in there that you have to give the answer to, of why didn't she come, or why did this happen, or why did that happen? And the Jewish rabbis in their rabbinic teachings, they say that the reason she didn't come was because Ahasuerus, the king, wanted her to come just wearing a royal crown and nothing else. Literally, she was expected to come with a crown on and nothing else to show her beauty. That's what the Jewish rabbis teach. Doesn't explicitly say that. But for whatever reason, Vashti refused to come. And so we see that within the story here, he gets counsel from his counselors, and the whole book of Esther makes King Ahasuerus, great as he is, out to be a little bit of a buffoon. He's somebody who can't make decisions on his own. He's always asking his counselors. And the one time in the book we see that he does make a decision, he bases it on his wrong interpretation of information. And there's a tremendous amount that's just happening behind the scenes. But basically Vashti is deposed, and there's a search made throughout the kingdom, and all the beautiful young women from 127 provinces, from Pakistan to Sudan, Ethiopia, right across to Greece, up to Russia. The whole land was scoured for people who could spend a year in beauty treatments, women, in order to go in and spend one night with the king, with a possibility that if they pleased him, they could be the new queen. And we've got a situation here that there happened to be there, living in Persia at this time, a man called Mordecai and his cousin Esther. Esther was an orphan, her parents had died. These two people had been born in Babylon, in Persia, in captivity. And dear Esther, she was beautiful. It wasn't her fault, but she just happened to be beautiful. And when the command went out for all the whole empire to be scoured for the beautiful women to come into the harem and be prepared to go in with the king, it says that Esther was taken. And I think that's interesting as we begin to look at the character of Esther, because it talks about the women being gathered. So throughout the empire, the women were being gathered, the beautiful women. And I think that they were probably, whoa, here's my chance. I could end up being the queen of Persia. And they were gathered. But it tells us that Esther was taken. And it talks later about the women coming in before the king when it was their turn to go into him. But it talks about Esther being taken. And I think that gives us a little insight into the attitude of her heart, that she was uncomfortable with the things that she had to do. And she didn't have any choice. She had to obey the commandment of the king. But as the story unfolds, we see that Esther eventually, she does become the queen. We see that her brother has a little bit of there's a man that's raised up as the prime minister, if you like, the second in the kingdom, a chap called Haman, who is an evil, wicked guy. And he gets it in from Mordecai, who is the cousin of Esther. And there's a little bit of something that starts to go between them. And the interesting thing here, I just want you to note in here, is where it gives the genealogy of Mordecai. And it says that he was born, his father, and that was somebody called Kish. He was a Benjamite. So his genealogy was that he came from the tribe of Benjamin. Some of his ancestors were called Kish, and we know that the first king of Israel was called Saul, and Kish was the father of Saul. So in the naming of Mordecai, we can see that he was a Benjamite descended from Saul. But in the first verse of Esther chapter 3, it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And to me, that's probably one of the most important verses in the whole story of Esther. You know, we usually think, who knows if you've been called to the kingdom for such a time as this. But if you look at this, it says that King Ahasuerus promoted this man Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And so you can see the scene is set in this battle between Mordecai, who, if you like, is the good guy, and Haman, who is the bad guy. Mordecai was a Jew descended from the Benjamites through Saul. Dear old Mordecai was. Haman, he was a wicked guy. He was an Agagite. Agag was king of the Amalekites. He was an Amalekite, right? Now, they had history. Going back, they had history. Now, when you read through the book of Esther, I'll come to that in a sec. When you read through the book of Esther, it's really important to know, you read the story and you think, well, this all happened pretty much in 12 months. You read through the story, you think, it's 12 months. That's it. It's a lovely, lovely story. But just be careful with the chronology in Esther, because it says that in chapter 1, verse 1, it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, etc., that he reigned over 127 provinces. Verse 3, that in the third year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials. So who's good at maths? Can you remember that? In the third year of his reign, right? A bit later on, we see that Esther becomes queen, and it tells us that it was in the 7th year of his reign. So from the time we see the feast taking place in the beginning and Vashti being deposed, it was from year 3 to year 7, which is how many years? 4 years, isn't it? So it was a 4-year time period between that and Esther becoming queen. There was a big time gap. And later on we can see that when this evil guy Haman decides that he's going to annihilate all the Jews, it was in the 12th year. So what's 7 from 12 is what? 5? So it was 5 years later. So the whole story here is taking place from, year 3 to year 12, which gives us about a 9-year period. And yet when you come to the book of Esther, you read it in a rush and you think, oh, this happened, oh, she was promoted, and that happened, oh yes, and Haman did this, and by the end of the year, it was all sorted. It wasn't. It took 12 years for the story to unfold. And what that tells me is that God is not in a rush. God is not in a rush. We tend to panic. We tend to think we want things done now. I want it now. I want it quick. I want it immediately. God, where are you? But God is dealing not just with our lives as individuals, but he is dealing with kingdoms. He is dealing with empires. He's dealing with the fact that there is a spiritual warfare going on in the heavenly places, and there are battles between Satan. There are battles between the angels of God, and things are happening up there. And God is in perfect control, and he is not rushed. So if there's one lesson from the book of Esther that we need to get to grips with to begin with, is it was year 3 was the feast. Year 7, it talks about Esther becoming queen, and then it talks about year 12, when Haman decides to have a decree to annihilate all the Jews. Right, so it took time. And God is not rushed. But if we go back now just to look at Genesis chapter 12, it talks about those who bless the people of God will be blessed, and those who curse the people of God will be cursed. We can see that Haman was an Agagite. Right? Now, if you know your Old Testament at all, that name Agag will ring a bit of a bell. But basically, I think Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, says that Agag is a synonym for Amalek, right? Who were a tribe, who were a very, very ancient people. And as you trace the story of Amalek through the scriptures, you can see when Lot was taken captive, Kedorlaomer was there, and they took them captive. That the Amalekites were also mentioned in Genesis 14 verse 7. Turned back, they came to Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites. So the Amalekites were a very, very ancient people. Right? When you look in Genesis chapter 36 and verse 6, you can see that Esau, Jacob's brother, his son married a concubine. 36:6 it was. Where are we? I can find it now. Well, he had a concubine called Timnah. Timnah. Now, Timnah, verse 12, was the concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son, and she bore Amalek to Eliphaz. These were the sons of Adah, Esau's wife. So we can see that Jacob I've loved, Esau I've hated. So Esau had his son gave birth to a child called Amalek. Right? So the Amalekites were an ancient nation, and whether this Amalek and them got together, we're not 100% sure, but it was 4,000 years ago. But the Amalekites are one of the key things you need to remember when you're reading the book of Esther. Because as the history of Israel unfolds, we can see that God is having warfare against these Amalekites. And there's something happening within the Amalekite nation that is significant and spiritual. You know, you hear in the scriptures about Gog and Magog, Agag. Very similar terminology, and there's linkages there. But when the children of Israel, they went down into Egypt, they come out of Egypt, and as soon as they come out of Egypt, they get attacked. And do you know who it is that attacks them? It's the Amalekites. In Exodus chapter 17, we see that God, as they come out past the Red Sea, etc., produces water from the rock. And then it says in verse 8 of Exodus 17, now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose men out and go and fight with them. And the story is that Moses goes up on the mount, and he has Aaron on one side and he has Hur on the other side. And whenever Moses has got the rod of God lifted up, Joshua prevails in battle. But when Moses' hands grow weary, the Amalekites prevail in battle. And so they took a rock, or sat Moses on a rock, and Aaron was on one side and Hur was on the other, and they held his hands up until the victory had been achieved. And that's a good picture there of intercession. It's a good picture there of prayer and warfare. And it says at the end of that little story, Moses built an altar and called its name, the Lord is my banner, Jehovah Nissi. For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So God is at war. He's at war with the Amalekites from generation to generation. Right? There's something going on here. These are very representative people, and God is at war with them. If you carry on through the scriptures, you can see that when Balaam, after the 40 years in the wilderness, they're coming in to the land of Moab, and Balaam gets Balak to come and try and curse the Israelites. But in Numbers chapter 30, Genesis, Exodus, I'm sorry, 24. Bear with me. Yeah, in Numbers chapter 24, Balaam, this false prophet under the anointing of God, is giving true prophecies and blessing Israel. He's turning the curse into a blessing. And it says there, how lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. This blessing, like valleys that stretch out, like gardens by the riverside, etc., etc. And then it says, his king shall be higher than Agag. Very strange. And his kingdom shall be exalted. Very important verse there. His king, that's Israel's king, shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. And then a little bit later in verse 20, then he looked on Amalek. This is Balaam, and he took up this oracle and said, Amalek was first among the nations, but he shall be last until he perishes. And at the end, it talks again about Amalek, until he perishes. There's a time when Amalek is going to perish as a nation. And these Amalekites are very, very symbolic of the spiritual warfare that is taking place. If you move on, not too long chronologically, but if you go into Moses just giving the last reading of the law before they go into the promised land, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 17, he says, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, and all the stragglers at your rear when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God. And that's when Satan comes in, isn't it? The people were marching on, all the weak ones and the weary ones were at the back, and that's where Satan hit, in their weakness and in their tiredness. And God remembered that. God remembered that. And God said, or Moses says here, that he attacked all your stragglers, all your weak ones. He didn't fear God. Therefore it shall be when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around, in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. I'm going to use you to destroy Amalek. I want you to blot out the remembrance of this Amalek and all that he stood for, this satanic kingdom who hated everything that God was doing. Spiritual warfare. We can move on in the scriptures, and we see in 1 Samuel chapter 15 about how Saul, King Saul, and here we've got Saul, son of Kish. King Saul is asked to go and to destroy the Amalekites. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. They were instruments in God's hand. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. And the people gathered together, and they attacked Amalek, and they didn't destroy him, they didn't destroy the leader, they didn't destroy the best of the sheep. And when Samuel comes along and he says, look, Saul, I thought God told you to destroy Amalek and everything that he had. Oh no, we kept the best to offer to God, etc., etc. And Agag, the king of the Amalekites, was kept alive. And Samuel comes and basically he chops Agag in pieces, destroys him, chops him in pieces. And God tells Saul that the kingdom was going to depart from him. The kingdom was going to depart from Saul because he wasn't obedient to the voice of the Lord. But we can see this king, Agag. And again, it's thought that term Agag, just like the pharaohs ruled over Egypt, and you had Pharaoh Necho and Pharaoh this-o and Pharaoh that-o, that Agag was perhaps a title, that the Agags were the kings of the Amalekites. And so, beginning to click in your mind, you can see that Haman, he was what? Son of Hammedatha, the what? The Agagite. There he is, cropping up. We can see there that you've got this tremendous fight going on all through Scripture. Spiritual warfare, God against the Amalekites, God against the Amalekites. If you go into, at the end of Samuel, into 1 Samuel chapter 30, you can see with David. Now, it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire. There they were again. They took David's wives into captivity, took all the goods into captivity. I think they were ready to stone David, but he came back and he fought and he won back everything that had been taken. There was that fight that was still going on. You can look again, if you move on in the scriptures to 1 Chronicles chapter 4, later on in the time of King Hezekiah. In the days of Hezekiah, it says in 1 Chronicles 4:41, it says that they dwelt in that place because there was no pasture for their flocks, etc., etc., and they defeated the rest of the Amalekites who had escaped. They've dwelt there to this day. They're a pesky foe. They just keep cropping up everywhere, attacking God's people. They're a real pesky foe. I like it what David said when he went out against Goliath. Was it 1 Samuel 17? I think this is something we can... When David goes out against Goliath, and he says to this foe that he was facing at the time, that David said to the Philistine, you come to me with sword, with spear, with javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God in heaven. And David had said there, but he comes in the name of the Lord, because the battle is the Lord's. When these things were taking place, it wasn't just men It was God working something powerfully in the heavenly realms above. And so we come through and we see that the Agagites are still around. And in this book of Esther, what you need to notice over this time period is that Satan is suddenly bringing his man. It's strange how this chap, Haman, sort of arises up through the midst. He arises up through the ranks until he has the ear of King Ahasuerus, the king over all the mighty empire of Persia. And he comes to be second in the whole of the kingdom. And the fact that he is an Agagite. And do you know what the Agagites do? They try and destroy Israel. They try and destroy God's people. He hated Israel. And when he finds out that Mordecai, the Jew, who was a son of Kish, actually was from the line of Saul, a Benjamite, there we see the animosity. There we see the spiritual warfare beginning to take place. And in the story of Esther, we've got this guy Haman, who when Mordecai won't bow to him as he passes by, I don't think that's anything to do with the three children, the fiery furnace, not bowing before images. It's just a fact that I don't think that Mordecai was going to bow as a son of Kish, as a Jew, before an Agagite, an Amalekite. He wasn't going to do that. And it just got Haman's goat. He hated it. And he decides, through this story of Esther, that he's not only going to take out Mordecai, but he's going to take out every single Jew in the whole of the empire. He was going to annihilate God's people. There would be no Messiah. There would be no fulfillment of God's promises. There would be no salvation for you. There would be no salvation to me if Satan won that victory. And so the book of Esther is a book about spiritual warfare. We've got Haman, the Agagite, who's in control, seemingly. And we've got Mordecai representing the Jews, who seems to be on a hiding to nothing when a decree is made that on a certain day, all the Jews are going to be annihilated in the kingdom. So it's not just a pretty story about a girl who happens to become queen and different things take place. This is a book about spiritual warfare and happenings. And it may be today that you're involved in spiritual warfare. But when you look at Esther, you can learn so much, because what did Esther have as a woman? She was beautiful. That was her asset. That was her gift. She was beautiful. What else did she have? She had a lovely character. She had just something about her, her looks and her character, that put her into the right position at the right time. And because of her being elevated by God into the right position at the right time, for her it must have been a bizarre set of circumstances, having to go in and spend the night with a king, and have a year of beauty preparations. It's a bizarre story. But behind it all, God is at work. God is at work. But all she had was her beauty. All she had was her character. And God took what she had and elevated her to be queen over the nation, basically so that the people could be saved, that the whole of God's purposes would come to pass. So when you begin to scratch in the book of Esther, you can see that underneath just the little glossy story, it's not just a year, it's 9 years at least. God's taking his time, but God is out to destroy the Amalekites. And after that, you hear no more in Scripture about the Agags or the Amalekites. They're gone. God doesn't forget. He doesn't forget. May take him years, but he will bring to pass his purposes. And he had war against these enemies. And God is fighting a battle today. There is a war that is going on in the heavenlies. There's wars that are going on for the souls of men and women, even in this town of Okehampton. And there are lessons that we can learn going forward about what part God wants us to play in that battle. But this morning I just want to leave you with that thought. I've really not even begun to scratch Esther. Maybe in the fish groups you can look at it. But it is a tremendously rich story. But I just want you to think this morning, if you were in spiritual warfare, if you're in battles, what I'd say to you is the battle is the Lord's. There are things happening up there that God is doing that you don't know that he's doing, but he is going to get the victory. And if you're struggling spiritually today, let me just suggest that you read 2 Chronicles chapter 20 about Jehoshaphat going out to battle. And when you've read it, why not read 2 Chronicles chapter 20 about Jehoshaphat going out to battle? Right? And when you've read that, why not read 2 Chronicles chapter 20 about Jehoshaphat going out to battle, and just absorb it into your being, because God fights our battles. He gives us the victory, right? But he does it in different ways, and it sometimes takes time. So just a gloss, difficult, but I just wanted to sort of set a scene for the book of Esther. Maybe that's slightly different to what you thought you were going to get. But this book, to me, is a book about spiritual warfare. And in the providence of God, we've had Ruth and Providence. We've got Esther, which is also about providence. We've got Joseph and providence coming up. The providential workings of God is something that we need to understand as a church.